Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. In this episode, we have a look at part 2 of The Wild Adventures of William Bligh. When we left off part 1, William Bligh had witnessed the death of Captain James Cook and had to navigate for Captain John Gore after the death of Discovery Captain Charles Clerk. There was a lot of death. He had seen the best and the worst of the Pacific, and despite not finding the intended route through to the Atlantic, they had fulfilled some of the mission's tasks, and upon returning home to England, he was now more worldly and skilled, especially in navigation and cartography. Now 26, he was back home and not a moment too soon. His father, Francis, was ill and died shortly after William returned. He now had no parents. His sisters were married and living their own lives. It was time for Bligh to chase his woman. Travelling to Douglas on the Isle of Man, he and Elizabeth Betham married the following month, being February 1781, in a village called Oncan. Elizabeth, known as Betsy, was quite smart and wealthy. Her uncle was Duncan Campbell, a successful and well-known commercial ship owner and plantation owner in the West Indies. Campbell became very fond of and became a mentor for Bligh. Bligh had also become close friends with England's elite, especially Sir Joseph Banks. Despite not getting much recognition aboard the Resolution on Cook's third voyage, he certainly was now well recognised. England declared war on the Dutch in December of 1780. Bligh was going to war too, aboard HMS Belle-Poule, under Captain Philip Peyton, and as sailing master. They were successful in their efforts at the Battle of Dogger Bank, despite casualties on both sides. Bligh became a commissioned officer and position of lieutenant, overseeing the ship HMS Berwick. This role was to be a little monotonous compared to his Cook voyage and Dutch battle. As the Dutch did not want to battle any more with England, they didn't need so many of the ships. But during this uneventful time, he had time to have his first of 6 daughters, Harriet Maria, in the November of 1781. Not long after this, he was 6th Lieutenant to HMS Cambridge, guarding Portsmouth. It was during the American Revolutionary War. He was also encouraged to contact a relative of Betsy's uncle, Admiral John Campbell, who was sailing to Newfoundland Station as governor. Bligh really wanted to get out onto the water, but this was not to be, and with the end of the war, the only thing Bligh was doing a lot of was fathering children. Mary was born in 1783, and a job with Betsy's uncle Duncan to help make ends meet, while there was no need for fleets of ships in the Navy. Betsy and the 2 girls left Isle of Man and settled into what would be the family's home in Lambeth, London, to be closer to William's posting, as he would now work for Duncan Campbell for 5 years, between 1783 and 1788. He was not forgotten by Banks, though. There had been a need in the West Indies plantations for a food resource easy to grow and to save them from needing food transported from the North America's sugar islands. Banks decided that Bligh would be the ideal candidate for this mission, set for around August 1787. Bligh, now 32, would be somewhat of a commander and the purser for the expedition in the South Seas for breadfruit tree pickup, transportation and delivery, which, if all went well upon returning to England, would make Bligh a captain. Tahiti to the West Indies. Bligh wanted to make sure it was successful, not only to see a promotion, but to ensure he made his mentors proud. Banks for organising the project, and Duncan Campbell, who made contact with his son in the West Indies to receive the breadfruit trees. It was quite the collaboration. Bligh did not want to let anyone down. But Bligh wouldn't leave before planting a few buns in the oven with Betsy. He now had Betsy Jr., or Elizabeth, and there were going to be twins on the way. The expedition would be aboard the Bounty, a smaller 220 tonnes compared to Resolution's 462 tonnes. It would be only 90 foot and 3-masted, full-rigged vessel, but the masts wouldn't be too tall. Superstition for the time suggested that a beautiful bare-chested woman figurehead sat under the bowsprit to lead the ship through the water and to shame the seas into being calm for the voyage. The Bounty's beauty was no different and wore a riding outfit. Due to the Bounty's size, all accommodation was below deck, but also fitted specifically to allow for the safe transport of the breadfruit trees, meaning a tighter living quarters, especially for Bligh, whose normal living area as a commander or captain would have been at least double the size. There was also no room for Marines on board to guard the ship. The hope was no one would want to steal a small ship full of breadfruit trees. And Bligh chose his crew himself, as was a captain's right, or commander's right, and he was not going to have any protection, so he chose those he knew well, at least where he could, including a young Fletcher Christian, aged 24, that he had been mentoring the past few years. They had met aboard the Cambridge 6 years ago. Christian then an eager 18-year-old. Bligh had taken him under his wing since, and had also got him work in Duncan Campbell's company. You would think over 6 years of friendship he would have a mate he could trust. Bligh chose men who had sailed with him before, many from the Campbell's company, as well as requests from friends and family who had boys that wanted to get on board. But he wasn't to know what was ahead of him. I mean, who could? Amongst those was 2 young men from wealthy families as midshipmen, Peter Hayward and John Hallett, both 15. Bligh, having started out as a youngster himself, was so desperate to make his mark in the world. He had a soft spot for these young men, when perhaps older, more loyal men would have been better. Although there were a few men that Bligh was forced to have on board. There was a John Fryer, whom he didn't know as master. Also a Thomas Huggins, the surgeon, who Bligh knew vaguely, but considered as a lazy drunk. He couldn't get rid of them off ship, but appointed his own surgeon, Thomas Ledward, just in case. Most of the other able shipmen were drawn from lower levels of society, which would also pose as an issue later on. Bligh organised for a fiddler to join the voyage, to keep crew entertained, and for dance and exercise, as well as having more men watch together on longer shifts to allow for better rest or longer time for sleeping. There were some delays in getting the Bounty out to sea too, and she didn't sail until December of 1787. The first fleet had come through and left for Australia. But Bligh needed Admiral Howe to give him the go-ahead, the namesake of Lord Howe Island, of course. Months went by, and Captain Arthur Phillip, now in Rio de Janeiro, requested that the Bounty bring them some valuable cargo that they needed in Australia, which Bligh wouldn't have minded at all, and it would have been quite interesting for him to have already visited before his later posting there as governor. But it was denied, as it was thought that the little 90-foot ship was best to go the quickest route to Tahiti with no variation. Also, despite Bligh being the commander of the Bounty, his official title was not that. He remained a lieutenant for the whole expedition, in the hope that he would return and be granted a better title. Bligh left on the voyage quite frustrated at the delays and his title. Bligh saw Betsy one last time with the 3 girls. Then there was quite a wind up, and they were finally given the go-ahead to sail. Now the story from here gets a little complicated, depending on which movie you watch, or whether or not you believe Bligh's diary or journal, or if you feel that the Christian family have the right answer. But most people know from here there's a mutiny. First, they do sail to Tahiti, and this is where it kind of all goes south. They're there for 5 months, and it's a long time since they've seen women, if you could understand their thought process for this time. As we've said before, many of the crew had been picked up, probably from bars and things like that against their will, and also from lower sections of society. Some of them probably didn't have any wives or women at home waiting for them, so many of them shacked up with the Tahitian women, as you'd expect they would for 5 months. The men had been at sea for quite a while, and they knew that they were going back home to whatever they had before, and for some, it wasn't much at all. Now, what storybooks tell us is that Bligh was quite rough with his treatment of the crew. Could it have been because he was frustrated at the title that he wasn't given before he left, and may not receive upon arriving home? Was it also that he missed Betsy and the kids? He had twins on the way that would be born, and probably born while he was away. And the crew themselves. He'd put a lot of effort into keeping them entertained with the fiddler, and also ensuring that they were watching at night in groups so as that the other groups would have longer sleep. Now you'd think that for all purposes this would be enough for the crew, but when they arrived at Tahiti and had spoils that you could only imagine on a tropical island with beautiful women in not much clothing, you could imagine their dismay at having to leave at some point. Now, whether they decided that they were going to stay in Tahiti before they arrived there, or while they were there, or if it was a decision made after they left, it's unclear. But they did make the decision to mutineer after they left Tahiti. They believed that the treatment that Bligh had was very harsh on them, and they didn't deserve that. So they took over ownership of the bounty, kicking Bligh and some of his loyal subjects into a long boat used for emergencies, I guess you could say. Some of the crew wanted to murder them, and some of them decided that probably putting them in the longboat was murder in itself. They'd never reach safety. Now it is believed that early on in the voyage, Bligh kept a journal or diary of each day. And for the most part in this diary, it is written that the men were quite happy and content, and he was happy and content that that was the case. It didn't give any indication that there was a mutiny about to happen, and it was believed that Bligh was quite shocked when it did, but more shocked that the ringleader of the mutineers was his mate Fletcher Christian, who'd he'd mentored for 6 years, got him jobs, and showed him the way to do things and ship life. He turned on him. Why? Well, it's anyone's guess. Was Bligh too rough on him? Or were the Tahitian women too alluring? Either way, he did the dirty on Bligh. But the Christian family believed that he was in his right to do it. Bligh was a tyrant and belt the men. There isn't any indication of beatings in the journals, only maybe 2 or 3 times. And there was something like 200 lashes given or something like that for the entirety of the trip. And over about 2 years, I believe, or 18 months or something, was the length of time from when they set out to when they mutineered. There was 200, doesn't seem much at all. And a lot of that was probably repeat offenders who were probably bored or angry that they were on the ship to begin with. Either way, the mutiny happened. Now Bligh and his loyal subjects, about 18 or so, were on the longboat for quite some time. They had to travel something like 3,000 miles to get to where they needed to get help. And it wasn't an easy journey, if you can imagine. But Bligh did know the area from his voyage with Cook all those years ago. He charted those maps and he knew how to navigate the area and went to an island that they'd been to before. He knew vaguely the people there and they got along quite well for a time. Now, if you can imagine, the time before when on Cook's voyage, they had a lot of things to give these people when they arrived, maybe a barter system or just gifts for the sake of it. Now, Bligh and these men were starving and hungry and they were hot and they didn't have anything to give these people. Now, at first it was probably a novelty to see them, but after a while, when there wasn't any gifts being given or barter system to speak of, and they were helping them out, they grew a little tired of it. Sadly, on the scramble to get back to the boat, one man lost his life. He was going back to get the anchor out of the surf when they set upon him. There was nothing that the crew could do besides yell and scream and will the people off him, but it wasn't to be. They stoned him and murdered him on the beach in front of them, and they sailed away. It was a bad memory for all on board. They would never think of the word Tofua, or the island, without remembering him dying on the beach. Now, we were watching something on TV that recreated the steps that Bligh took in the longboat with the men. Now, from what we learned there, they were meeting up with people on these islands, but they weren't getting the nourishment that they needed on the voyage, so they were almost near death by the time they reached the destination in which that they could get help, Timor. And when they got there, they basically got in contact with whomever in England to organise for their recovery and for the arrest of the mutineers. That was the next thing to go wrong for the mutineers. Bligh, for all purposes at this point in time, was a hero. He saved all the men on the longboat, all except their other hero, Quartermaster John Norton. The rest all went back to their families. One thing in particular, that the young fella, Peter Haywood, that Bligh had allowed to come on board for the voyage, he was one of the men that mutineered. He was very sorry when he met up with their family and explained to them that he would probably hang for his part in the mutiny, as would all the others. Now, not all of the loyal subjects were able to fit on the boat, and some were taken on board as prisoners on the Bounty. When they reached Tahiti, the mutineers lived it up, and probably did the men that they kidnapped. They may not have liked the situation, but they probably made the most of it. And it wasn't until the Royal Navy was dispatched to Tahiti that Fletcher Christian and a couple of others fled to Pitcairn Island, and not discovered for some time. Pitcairn Island hadn't been on the charts. Now, it is believed that the Christian family, or Fletcher Christian's descendants, are many throughout Pitcairn Island and Tahiti. Some have even reached Australia. But the real story, no one would really know, except those on board the ship. Were they bullied by Bligh? Or were they just lazy and enjoyed tropical life with women? Who could blame them? But what we do know, based on Bligh's log entries, he would write in a journal most days and update on the weather and the men and the surroundings, what was going on and how everyone was feeling. For the majority of the trip to Tahiti initially, the Bounty was thrashed in the waters. Men were sick, but this wasn't Bligh's fault. He was navigating a course. The men were well fed, it was documented. Even on Christmas Day, they received rum, beef and pudding. As well as when they were sick, he would look after them, make sure fires were burning below deck, and that they had hot meals. There was much snow, and the men fought to keep control of the ship. Much of the supplies went overboard, and they did well not to follow suit themselves. No wonder they didn't want to get on board again for the journey home. But for all purposes, the journal didn't state that there was many thrashings at all. In fact, at one point in the journal, Bligh was delighted that he didn't have to thrash anyone or give them lashes, and those who were lashed were done so because of insolence and contempt, meaning that they wouldn't do what they were meant to do for the captain. But was it that he wasn't a captain? That they weren't showing him the respect and the authority that a captain would have earned? He was only a lieutenant, remember? He didn't have the title. But what happened to the mutineers? We know they did eventually go to Pitcairn Island, but that was only Christian and a couple of his followers. The remainder stayed in Tahiti, where they were picked up by the HMS Pandora. On Pandora's arrival, the loyalists that were kidnapped approached Captain Edward Edwards and notified him of the situation, that most of the mutineers were around the island. They went forth over the next couple of days, capturing all those who had eluded them. Once they had them all on board and in cells below, they left. Now, on the way back to England, the Pandora ran aground at the Great Barrier Reef and started sinking. The Pandora's crew lost 31 men and 4 of the prisoners, including one of Bligh's loyalists. Luckily, a neighbouring boat came and rescued them. Of the remaining prisoners, 10 were taken back for trial. 3 of them were pardoned, 4 of them were acquitted, mostly being his loyalists, and 3 hanged. Bligh was not at the trial, as he'd already been organised to go on another expedition. So not only were his logs not entered as evidence, he wasn't present himself to stand up for his name. And the men who were pardoned banded together to ensure that they slandered Bligh as brutal and harsh. One of those being James Morrison, the boatswain. He would write a damning journal after the fact that many got hold of, including Edward Christian. By now, news of Fletcher Christian's death had reached London. His brother Edward was most upset that the Christian name had been slandered, being that Fletcher Christian was apparently the ringleader of the mutiny, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it, which pretty much meant making sure Bligh took the rap for the mutiny. Now, with Fletcher, he'd been murdered by one of the natives on Pitcairn Island, something about kidnapping of women. But they didn't have smooth sailing. Most of the men had abandoned Fletcher on Pitcairn and had been living there. Some of them died, some of them murdered each other, and one man, John Adams, lived until the 1830s. But as for Edward, he wanted to ensure that the Christian name was saved and Bligh's was muddied. So he interviewed all of Bligh's crew, well, the mutineers anyway, and got a good story going, as well as James Morrison's journal that he'd written after the fact. All this evidence mounted against Bligh, and when forwarded to high-ranking officials, made things bad for Bligh, especially as he wasn't there for the trial to counter these claims. But it wouldn't do him too much damage. He still had friends in high places himself, and he would still be recommended for the governor's position in New South Wales. The journal of James Morrison, the boatswain, in conjunction with Edward Christian's letters, would be used for the most part for the movies that were made, and it was a little one-sided. Now we know the story from here, that Bligh was the 4th Governor of Australia, recommended by Sir Joseph Banks. Now, if he was such a tyrant, surely he'd be offered up later on. But he had his girl with him, and we know the story with Mary, and his love for his wife, and that he was on the side to try and make New South Wales a better place for everyone. But you could decide for yourself whether or not you think Bligh was such a bad guy. I've done my little bit of research, and I don't think he was. I think that the men just wanted to stay in Tahiti, and who could blame them really? But they did perform act of treason against their captain or lieutenant. See, that may have been another thing too. Bligh hadn't been given captain status, so perhaps the men didn't feel like he had much authority over them. There were no Marines on board, so really it was doomed from the beginning. And the breadfruit, well, if we can believe the movie with Clark Gable, they tossed that shit out the side of the boat the second Bligh was in his boat. They'd been wrapped up so nicely by the Tahitians and sank to the bottom of the Pacific. Yeah, poor things, they never had a chance. And the poor slaves never got to eat it. Well, they probably would have at a later stage. Someone would have gone ahead and completed that mission. But for Bligh, it was on to bigger and better things, as we know. Before Bligh went on to become the 4th Governor of New South Wales, he went back to his family, and the girls, now 2 years older, roughly, and twins. There was some time that he spent there before going to New South Wales, and in that time he raised 6 girls with Betsy. There's a funny story that comes from this family, and I thought I'd add it in just to show you that because people may seem of higher society doesn't mean they don't have the same problems that everybody else does, as we saw with Mary's story. This particular story is around his twin girls. Now the story went that there was an advert in the local newspaper. A man wanted a wife and advertised so. He put his heart out there for a woman to come and join him in matrimony. Well, the girls got hold of this newspaper and thought it would be hilarious to respond to the ad and have the fella meet them at a local church area. Well, it kind of blew up in their face. They did arrive to find the poor soul waiting around for his love to find him. And when he went inside the church, he found the twin girls giggling and snickering to themselves. When he went to approach them as to what they were laughing about, probably assuming it was a setup, they ran off. Well, he gave chase and followed them all the way to their front door. Well, when they arrived, they rushed inside and the man knocked on the door. To his surprise, William Bligh answered the door and asked the man what it was that he wanted. The man explained the situation. He'd put an advert in the paper wanting a wife, and 2 little girls answered that ad. Bligh's twin girls. Well, if you can imagine a father's scorn when he finds that his young girls have embarrassed him so. Well, if Bligh was such a tyrant, they would have had red bottoms from smacks, no doubt, or whippings. But I don't think that went down. I think he probably gave them a stern talking to and had them do many chores, and the man simply was made to go away, no doubt. I just thought that was a funny story. Girls get into so much trouble. And what would have happened if the man had have caught them? Heaven knows. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more Aussie stories.